They were the best, trained for years, feared across every front. These were not ordinary men. These were the Luftwaffe's finest, and yet they were losing. Not to superior numbers, not to better weather, not to luck. They were losing to an aircraft that their own enemies had already thrown away, rejected, dismissed, called useless. But somewhere over the burning fields of the Eastern Front, that same rejected aircraft was making Germany's best pilots disappear, one by one. And the answer was sitting in a small leather pouch, on the left side of a cockpit. Written by hand, in Russian, "Welcome to WWII Ghost Wings, the channel where forgotten aircraft tell the stories that history books skipped." Now, before we go any further, if you have not subscribed yet, think of it this way. You wouldn't leave the house without your reading glasses, would you? Don't watch history without subscribing first. Hit that button. It takes 1 second. And tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from today? Whether you're in London, Lahore, or somewhere in between. We want to know. In the summer of 1943, something was going wrong over the Eastern Front, and nobody in Berlin could explain it. The Luftwaffe had built its reputation on precision. Key's pilots were not recruited carelessly. They were selected through a process that eliminated the average and the hesitant, leaving only men of exceptional reflexes, strong nerves, and deep technical training. By the time a Luftwaffe fighter pilot reached the Eastern Front, he had already logged hundreds of hours in the air. He had studied enemy tactics. He had been drilled in the geometry of aerial combat until the movements lived in his muscles, not just his memory. These men were elite, and they knew it. But in the summer and autumn of 1943, the reports coming back from Eastern Front squadron commanders told a different story. Pilots were not returning from engagements they should have won. Aircraft were being lost at altitudes and in conditions where German fighters held what appeared to be every structural advantage. The losses were not catastrophic in the way that a single bad battle produces catastrophic numbers. They were steady, consistent, a slow bleeding that no tactical adjustments seemed to stop. Leadership in Berlin studied the reports and reached for familiar explanations. The Soviets had more aircraft. The weather was difficult. The terrain was unfamiliar. These explanations were not entirely wrong, but they were incomplete. And incomplete explanations, when accepted as sufficient, have a way of allowing the real problem to continue undisturbed. The real problem was not the weather. The real problem was not Soviet numbers. The real problem was that the Luftwaffe's finest pilots had been trained to fight a specific war, at a specific altitude, against a specific type of threat. And the war they were actually fighting on the Eastern Front matched almost none of those conditions. They had been given a doctrine built for high-altitude interception over Western Europe. They were fighting a low-altitude, grinding war over mud and fire and frozen river crossings. The Flaw was not in their hands. It was in their assumptions, and assumptions are the most expensive thing a professional can carry. In Buffalo, New York, in 1937, a quiet engineer named Robert Woods asked a question that nobody in aviation had ever seriously asked before. What if we moved the engine? It's not a dramatic question on the surface, not the kind of question that makes headlines. But in the world of aircraft design, it was close to revolutionary. Every fighter plane in existence carried its engine at the front, not because engineers had studied the problem and concluded it was optimal, but because that was simply how it had always been done. Tradition dressed up as engineering logic. Woods was not interested in tradition. He took the Allison V1710 engine and placed it directly behind the pilot, at the precise center of gravity of the aircraft. The result was the Bell P-39 Airacabra. And on paper, it looked strange. The propeller was still at the nose, connected to the engine by a long drive shaft running beneath the cockpit floor. Between the pilot's legs, the entry doors opened like a car. Chrome handles, side panels. It looked more like a sports car with wings than a weapon of war. Senior military evaluators in America saw it, studied it, tested it at 25,000 feet, watched its engines struggle in thin air, and quietly set it aside. The British tried it over northern France, found it unfamiliar, returned it without ceremony. Two of the most powerful air forces in the world looked at this aircraft and saw a problem. They were not wrong about the data. The Allison engine above 15,000 feet lost nearly 40% of its power. At 25,000 feet, it was nearly useless. That was a real limitation. That was a real number. But here's what both nations failed to ask. Useless. Where exactly? Because below 10,000 feet. That same engine breathed like it was born for combat. The roll rate was faster than anything Germany had in the air. The centerline cannon fired with a precision that wing-mounted guns could never match. The aircraft had not changed. The question had no nation that finally asked the right question was not the one that built it. There is a certain kind of professional who does not simply practice their craft. They study it like a scientist studies a problem, like an engineer studies a system, with paper, numbers, and cold precision. Alexander Pukrishkin was that kind of man. He was not the loudest pilot on the Eastern Front. He was not the most decorated at the start of the war. He was not the one commanding attention in briefing rooms. But somewhere over the burning landscape of Ukraine, in the cockpit of an aircraft that America had discarded, he was doing something that almost nobody else in the sky was doing. He was calculating, while other pilots flew on instinct. Pukrishkin flew on geometry, studied the 37mm centerline cannon the way an artillery officer studies ballistics, calculated the optimal firing range for different target types. Fighters, bombers, transport aircraft. He accounted for closing speed, deflection angle, target size. He wrote the numbers down. He tested them in actual combat, recorded the results, corrected the errors, and flew again. In that small leather pouch, attached to the left side of his cockpit instrument panel, were pages of handwritten notes, not prayers, not motivational phrases, not reminders of home. Firing tables, range calculations, dispersion patterns at varying distances, correction factors for wind, circled numbers annotated in the margins, evidence of a man who treated every engagement as data to be studied after landing. When German engineers at Rechlin finally translated those notes, the evaluation room went quiet, because what they were reading was not the work of a lucky pilot. It was the work of a system. Pukrishkin had understood something profound, something that separated him not just from other pilots, but from every professional who relies on experience alone. Instinct repeats what you already know, but a system discovers what you don't. He finished 1943 with over 20 confirmed victories added to his total. German radio operators on the Eastern Front began broadcasting warnings. The moment his call sign appeared, an honor so rare, it entered Soviet aviation as legend. But Pukrishkin himself credited none of it to talent. He credited the notebook. In the autumn of 1943, a thick, carefully written report landed on the desk of the Reich Air Ministry. It was not an opinion. It was not a guess. It was not the frustrated complaint of a losing commander. It was science. The Rechlin evaluation team had spent weeks dismantling every component of the recovered P-39, measuring, calculating, testing. They had flown it. They had studied Pukrishkin's handwritten firing tables. They had run the numbers on the centerline cannon multiple times, because the first result seemed too uncomfortable to accept. One hit. Just one. From that 37mm cannon exceeded the structural tolerance of every German fighter currently in operational service. They documented the roll rate advantage. They identified the specific altitude band, below 10,000 feet, where Soviet pilots held every meaningful advantage. And then they went further. They proposed solutions, specific adjustments to aileron geometry. changes to the balance tab system, its modifications that could partially offset the P-39's dominance. In low-altitude horizontal combat, the recommendations were precise, technically sound, and operationally urgent. The Reich Air Ministry read the report and did nothing, not because the findings were wrong, not because the engineers lacked credibility, but because the factories were already running at full capacity, producing aircraft around the clock, simply to replace the losses already bleeding the Luftwaffe white. There was no room in the production schedule for refinement. There was no slack in the system for correction. And so the most dangerous document the Luftwaffe ever produced about its own weakness was filed away, while the war continued, exactly as the report had warned it would. This is the moment where the P-39 story stops being about aircraft and starts being about something every serious professional must understand. The most expensive failure in any organization is never the problem nobody saw coming. It is the problem that was seen clearly, documented precisely, handed upward through proper channels, and then quietly ignored, because acting on the truth was less convenient than continuing with the plan. Germany did not lose those pilots because it lacked intelligence. It lost them because it lacked the institutional courage to act on what it already knew, and that flaw was never in the aircraft. It was never in the pilots. It was in the room, where the decisions were made, and the paperwork was left to wait.